I was going to ask you about what experiences what's like your earliest experience being in Alabama of racism?
Well, you know, that's just part of it. The earliest experiences, I suppose, was the fact that Mom would have a black maid come in, you know, sometimes to help cook or sometimes to clean the house and all like that. I never thought anything about it, but she could never come to the front door, of course.
Mm.
Although inside the house we were all friendly, stuff like that. But she had to come in the back door or leave the back door. She couldn't, no way she could fix our meal, but she couldn't sit down and eat with us. Just took all those things for granted. That's the way it was.
Did you get to know her very well?
Oh yeah. But, but didn't know where she lived. We knew she lived down an alley and in some other places where the Negro people lived. It's just impossible to imagine in this day what it was. I can remember a little gang of black boys, and we had several in our little gang. We'd throw rocks at each other sometimes. And some of them were very fine rock throwers. We didn't like to get in any kind of a deal with them. Of course, they couldn't play ball or go to school with us or anything else. Grew up thinking, as all the people in the South did, that we were superior. You know, white superiority was the thing that just drummed into you all the time. But I suppose because of our church background, and because our folks, and particularly my dad, was a little more liberal, Jane and I, by the time we got to be teenagers, were seeing that wasn't all quite right. So from the time we were in MYF as teenagers, we were determined that we'd do everything we could to be against that. For instance, we'd have our MYF go to meet with a black youth group or have them over to visit ours and stuff like that. Although the adults didn't like it, it was done. But even though I saw a black high school quarterback throw a ball about 70 yards, it didn't register. I still thought that was just entertaining, that freakish kind of a thing, you know, that no way, never thought about those people competing against us. We'd have found out real quick. You know, Willie Mays was growing up out in Fairfield, Alabama, just where my Aunt Bertie lived. I mean, found out he could play baseball as good as I could. Oh, it's just
a little better.
Possible to see.
Was everything entirely segregated? I mean, you had a white church, white school.
Oh yeah,
white
100%. White people walked down the sidewalk if you were several abreast and there wasn't room, and black people come, they had to walk out in the street.
Mm.
Couldn't drink at a whites only water fountain, you know. If there was one, some dingy one somewhere, and say colored only. Couldn't go to theaters. They'd have the upstairs balcony, or a part of it would be for black people only. Of course, they didn't use the term black in those days, Negro people. Whereas most people said niggers.
Mm-hmm.
We were always careful in our family to say Negro,
mm-hmm.
which we thought was more courteous. Yeah, the baseball, it's interesting. Birmingham Barons baseball field, which has been in some movies because I think it's still the oldest extant baseball field of its type, still with some of the same old advertising on the outside wall and all. Over in the right field, one little section of stands, and over there we had Negro bleachers, and that's where black people could sit and watch. And left-handed hitters would try to hit the ball over into there. And so, but they had a team called the Birmingham Black Barons. And the Birmingham Barons was our white team in the Southern Association. We watched them, they were good. You know, we had people there who'd go to the big leagues. Had some people from the big leagues who were finishing their careers there. I thought about the Birmingham Black Barons, even though they had people like Satchel Paige and Cool Papa Bell and others that turned out, you know, they're now in the Hall of Fame as better ball players than any we ever had playing for the Birmingham Barons. It's just that whole culture is just different. Black people, white people mingled downtown in department stores, shopping and stuff like that. But on streetcars, buses, of course, they had to sit in the very back. I don't know. I thought of it often as a boy and a young man. If I had been treated like that, I would have been fighting all the time. I don't see how they stood it. It wasn't just Martin Luther King and his nonviolent stuff that he learned from Gandhi, but it was just their way of life pretty much, because that was the only protection they had from keep from actually getting killed. And a lot of them did get killed. There were, found out now there were hundreds of lynchings in through that area of the South. If anything happened at all, that particularly if somebody thought that a black person had winked at a white girl or something like that, that was a capital offense. Not with the law, but they'd take them out. Ku Klux Klan would. Guys who were leaders in the churches, the bankers, the mayors, people like that, all involved. It's impossible to think of it now, but there's a culture of violence against black people.
What examples do you have from your dad of him like going against it?
My dad did not. He didn't openly go against anything like that. I guess. Well, not that I knew of. I don't know what he did with all of his time, but he treated them with respect. He would call a Negro man that worked for him Mr. So-and-so, which was a no-no in the South, but Daddy would do that. So I guess that was a good part of our learning. And we told you the story about where Dorothy went to school at what's now the University of Montevallo. The state legislature had a law that no black person could be on the stage of any state school except in the capacity as a janitor or a worker. You couldn't have a black singer or a speaker or anything like that. I was president of our North Alabama Youth Council, and we wanted to have a man from Fisk University who was we thought, a great speaker and a great Christian leader, and he was, to be our speaker. So what should we do? So we got some people to build a little place out in front of the middle of the stage in the big auditorium at what's now the University of Montevallo, and we just set up chairs and table and mic out there, and that's where we had to speak. So technically we were not against the law, but they raised all kind of hob about it. Well, from then on, the Methodist Youth Fellowship, at least those of us who were like officers, we decided that, like with the National Conference of Methodist Youth, we'd never meet in a place that was segregated. If we couldn't meet all together, you know, someplace we wouldn't meet. And so the youth and the student movement were well in advance of the church on that. We started way back in 1940 calling for an end to the central jurisdiction. There was a northeastern, southeastern, north central, south central, and western jurisdictions in our church, all white. Then there was a central jurisdiction that included all black churches, from Delaware to California to everywhere. I mean, it was just a farce. And of course, black ministers only in black churches. There's no such thing as a black minister in a white church. And we called for an end to that. That didn't happen until, well, after I was here in Montana, so it would be around 1960 or so that finally came to pass. But what we kept thinking and what we kept saying all the time is, if the student generation works a certain way now, 20 years from now, our boys and girls will be, assuming they hold on to it, be in positions to change it. And so it was. People did their darndest to break up the National Conference of Methodist Youth and to do everything they could to stymie student movement. We used to have, every annual conference had a Methodist Youth Fellowship with a council and a president. And that president of all, there were about 100 conferences then, became part of the National Conference of Methodist Youth. Also, every state student movement had officers, had a president. And so they became a student section of the National Conference of Methodist Youth. Those presidents all together made up the National Conference. You know, we elected our own officers, we raised our own money, we had an office with an administrative secretary, and we had all kinds of projects. Though the Methodist Publishing House was well known for breaking labor strikes in the South, and ultra-conservative people running the whole thing, the young people, put out a little daily devotional booklet called Power and a bi-weekly newspaper called Concern, and it was in our rules we had to have the union label on ours, so of course we didn't print it with the Methodist Publishing House. It amounted to several thousands. It was a pretty big printing job. We did it with a little company just across the bridge. This Nana's mother was sister to the Robert Ingersoll, who was famous in his day for being called an atheist, and he was a great writer and stuff, kind of a compatriot of Clarence Darrow.
I remember that name. I was wondering why.
Robert Ingersoll. Many a preacher inveighed against him.
And Robert Ingersoll would have been your great uncle.
Yeah. Great uncle.
Great uncle.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
Fire away.
All right. So you were telling us about the picture and the people in it, and
The picture that includes my grandfather, William Wallace Harper, for whom my father was named later, his wife, Mary Elsie Ingersoll, she lived with us as an older lady, who finally met her demise in Texas. Either fell off a horse or down the steps at about the age of 99, and it led to her untimely death. And her mother, old Mrs. Ingersoll, who was a sister or sister-in-law of Robert Ingersoll, the famous, quote, atheist, and little Uncle Orrin, who sired a bunch of kids down in Mexico, and we just found contact with them not many years ago. So there they are, quite a group. My grandfather, I was telling you, was with Grant at Appomattox. My grandfather Atkins on the southern side was with Lee at Appomattox. That was the last time, if you think of family squabbles, my father and my mother, that's the last time the Harpers ever won a battle, I think. Okay.
Now, so Uncle Orrin was the, as you said, the progenitor of the Mexican Harper clan.
Yeah. Who were really excited to meet Dorothy and me at a Harper family reunion in Ohio about 8-10 years ago. And the excitement was caused when they discovered that I was a reverend. And I can remember that both Alex and Tony jumped up and said, "What?" when I was introduced. A reverend in our family? And then the stories began to come about how the clan had been written up in some magazine article or book called the Hard Fighting, Hard Drinking Harpers, all of which they were at the time. And they just couldn't believe that they'd have it. So they had to immediately stand on both sides of me and have a picture taken just to show the world and themselves that there was some religious part of the family. Turned out that they are not that tough at all, but their immediate father and uncles were quite tough, because those boys had to join with their father, my Uncle Orrin, and my father during the years he was down in Mexico with them as a young man, several times in fighting the Yaqui Indians. 2 or 3 times their house was under attack. The girls, a couple of girls involved, and wife would be loading making the ammunition and loading the guns, and the boys and the dad and Uncle Orrin be firing out the windows. And so they had a kind of a hectic time down in northern Mexico.
What were Orrin and your dad doing in Mexico?
They were in the mining business. And you know that story about our father and a Canadian partner finally made enough money that they could quit that business, had about $100,000 or so. They couldn't get off the top of the mountain where their mine was because they were pinned down by the, quote, fierce Yaqui Indians. One of the Mexican workers got through the lines and ran 100 miles in 10 hours. My dad liked to tell that story to encourage me when I was a runner later on. And he got the Federalistas to come up, and they lifted the siege. And so Dad and this Canadian partner were heading for Canada because Canada was already involved in World War II. Dad was going to go up and enlist in the Canadian Army with this man. They got down to a railroad, started out of the country. The train was stopped by Pancho Villa and his boys, and they took off. That was the instance where he took off, I don't know, 20 or 40 American and Canadian people, lined them up, and just at the last minute, Dad noticed one of the men motioning, and apparently somebody that he had treated well or befriended during the time he was there put in a good word for them. So Via had the two of them step aside, and the rest of them were machine gunned. But that didn't mean they came away with their goods. They came across the U.S. line riding on a donkey. My dad had on a long pair of underwear, and the other fellow had a sombrero. That's what they came out of Mexico with. Later on, a few months later, he was wishing he'd be back in that sunny clime when he was in the city and around Ypres in Belgium, which was the bloodiest, most terrible series of conflicts probably in history. And at the so-called Second Battle of Ypres, he was gassed. The Germans first used gas, and they weren't, of course, prepared for it. They did save themselves, many of them. The Canadians, for whatever reason, they discovered that if they urinated, like on a bandana or a handkerchief or something, and held that over their nose, it acted like a gas mask against the chlorine gas or mustard, whichever one it was the Germans were using first. He went through all of that stuff, was called back at one time to receive the King George Medal of Honor for who was the guy? Sergeant York, our Sergeant York, who went around and took a whole bunch. Well, Dad pulled that kind of a deal too with he had studied a little German in high school in Cleveland, Ohio, and it saved his life, he said. A German pillbox machine gunner was holding them all down in the trench, clipping off anybody that raised their head. So he and two other guys were going to go up and see if they could sneak around behind and do something about it. He didn't know it at the time, but the other two guys, as soon as they got up, were hit. And he got out of the trench, worked his way around, threw a grenade in to the pillbox enclosure, and ordered them to come out. The German major stuck his head up and hollered back down, "There's only one." And so Daddy shot him between the eyes, he said. And as he fell back down in, the others knew something was serious, so they all came out. About 17 of them, and everyone as they came by him handed him a watch, because the Americans were, the Canadians were famous for wanting to take a trophy home with them. So he took care of that. And that kind of business kept up until 2 weeks before the end of the war, before the armistice. He was hit, and then spent the next 2 years after they got back to Canada in Vancouver in the hospital. And then after that made his way south where he met Mother and so forth and so on. All that came out of Mexico.
Now, why was he in the Canadian Army?
Well, the United States wasn't in the fight, and he wanted to go with his buddy. I've read stories about guys that used to just call them adventurers or something. And it sounds to me like my father was sort of that way. I mean, as a very young man, he's working down through the mines in this territory. Had that incident in Tombstone when Pat Masterson, the sheriff, chased a guy through the little dining car or restaurant where they were sitting, shooting. Hit a bottle of ketchup between Dad and the guy he was sitting with in that narrow little confines. Other fellow hollered, "By God, I've been shot," and there was red all over him. Meanwhile, the guy ran out the other end, and Masterson after him. So things like that on the way down. Then when he got to Mexico, he we don't know all those early stories actually. Evidently, he married the daughter of the governor of Sonora, who became president of Mexico later, and who was a real good person apparently. Maybe since purging and others were cursing into Mexico occasionally, and there was bad feelings between the two countries, it wouldn't have been for the president's daughter to be married. I don't know. Anyway, that's a part of the thing I never heard until one of our Mexican cousins came up with a story. So, Dad was into a lot of stuff. I mean, he was obviously, he was 6 feet tall, which was tall in those days. He weighed 180, 185 pounds. He was muscular, and he probably was into a lot of scrapes and stuff along the way. In my docile nature, I didn't get any of that from his genes, but he was into a lot of stuff. I'd like to have known him as a younger man. And he probably, although he was absolute teetotaler as I knew him, he probably was a part of the hard drinking, hard fighting Harpers as a young man.
What stories do you have of his brother and that group of folks and some of their scrapes in there?
Well, we got to say this for them. The family, or at least the bulk of them, some of them stayed in Mexico, moved into Los Angeles, in the San Diego area, and that's where Uncle Orrin died. Uncle Orrin was quite a drinker. I think finally, before he died, did give up the drink. But his sons learned to pick it up. In fact, and one daughter, who was named Carrie, and she would like to drink with her brothers. And one time after she was married, her husband came and tried to get her out of the bar where she was drinking with her brothers, and the brothers beat up her husband. Don't you be coming in trying to bulldoze our sister, they said. One of them was such a drinker, the one who was one day going into the liquor store and came out with a whole bunch of liquor in his arms, and a young hoodlum jostled him and said, "Old man, give me some of that liquor, or I'm going to take it away from you." And he just set the bag of bottles down, picked the guy up, stomped him into the opening between the old bumper that used to stick out from cars and the car, and just jerked him forward and broke his legs. So the old man was tough. I mean, that they deserved their appellation as hard drinking, hard fighting Harpers. Even on his deathbed, he wanted all the liquor, and he was smoking a cigar and drinking heavily when he expired, that one particular one. But what I was trying to say is these young half-Mexican kids did all right. One of them became a well-known international lawyer. Having retired from that, he's now an owner of quite a bit of property in San Diego and out on the San Diego beach. Another one of the brothers of his brothers is a prominent builder who contracts and builds these super million-dollar mansions. So they've done all right. In fact, almost any of the Mexican Harpers could buy us all out several times over. But enough.
What would you owe that to? I mean, why have they been so financially successful, do you think?
Well, I met the mother, who would be a daughter-in-law of Oren, Uncle Oren. And she, very refined, cultured, speaks Castilian, Spanish, Italian, smart as can be. She's now about 95, 96 years old. And just having met her and knowing her and the kind of training that she gave them, I mean, these immigrants, just like Mexican immigrants today or immigrants from other countries, when they come, they have a will to work. And when they see opportunities, they take them. So our side of the family never had to do any of that kind of struggling. So we just mediocre, and they've achieved a lot.
What's the story that, is it Alex has about representing, as a lawyer, representing...
Well, speaking of that mother,
Uh-huh.
who now lives quite safely and well in Mexicali, which is right on the Mexican-Arizona or California line. That it is kind of a headquarters, or at least was some years ago, for one of the big mafia-type bosses of Mexico, who got into trouble, and Alex, being a lawyer, knowing what the case was, saw that anybody could get him off easily if he had the right kind of legal counsel. This man asked Alex if he would be his lawyer, and he said no. He asked him 2 or 3 other times. He said no. Well, you're on one condition. I'll pay you whatever you want. No, I don't want any of your money. I just want a handshake. And a handshake meant that when the mafia boss gave you the handshake, that was a pledge that would be kept. What is it? Well, I want you to say that you'll see that my mother is protected and cared for in Mexico, where she lives now. And the fellow shook hands on it. And evidently, she is well looked after, because there are times, I think still, when a limousine pulls up to her house, chauffeured by one of the mafia boys, and takes her to grocery shopping or something else. And Alex is perfectly content that his mother is going to be looked after. And that was all the pay he wanted, and that's what he got.
The stories of Uncle Oren and so forth, did you know them before you met Alex and Tony?
No.
Those
Didn't know anything, any of these things at all. It was his mother who finally told Alex, I think that you ought to tell George some of these early stories, because it's not right that he not know them. See, I don't know what a mother ever knew, that my father had been married at one time in Mexico. Jane and I certainly never heard that. We had no inkling of it. So it came as quite a surprise. She thought we would just be devastated and shocked. Of course, I wasn't, and then Jane wasn't either. I mean, heck, you know, kind of proud of the old man. I mean, when he married well in Mexico. What happened to it, I don't know. They did have one son who was what was called a midget. And his name was Robert. Among other things, he came to the United States to college, and evidently he graduated. He died some years ago, so I never had a chance to meet him or know anything much more about him. The Annie Carey the one that was drinking with their brothers in the bar the night her husband got beat up, kept in correspondence with him regularly, and had all that correspondence and stuff. But somewhere when she died, all that was lost. At least that's what we've heard. So we don't know any. It'd be very interesting to know. So I never knew that I had a half brother. Since he was short, and since Dad was involved in it, Uncle Aaron's boys were afraid that some of their children were going to be short. So Alex himself, as a little boy, took, I guess people used to take gold to make sure you didn't turn out to be a midget or something.
Did they like?
And he was very concerned, all of his boyhood, his family was, that he should grow up to be, you know, average size or better. So there's a lot to be learned.
What stories did you know of your dad before you met Alex? And tell me, what were the stories that you had heard?
Well, I knew some of the mining stories have just come up. A fellow named Rex Beach used to be quite a writer for magazines and stuff like that, wrote short stories. I can remember once or twice came by our house in Birmingham and would pump Dad for stories that he would later use as a basis for his novels that he was working on. Well, you know, Indian fighting, mining, up in the Sierra Madres, and of course all the. He didn't like to talk about the war. Occasionally something would slip out. That's where I get some of these other stories. Of course, he had to tell about what happened. He still carried shrapnel in his leg, in his right ankle, in that area, all the time I was growing up. So he had that. He had malaria that he picked up in Bolivia or somewhere in South America when he and his brother took a sortie down there. And then of course he still had an occasional relapse or something with the gas that he'd suffered in World War II. So for the shape he was in, but I mean outwardly and just normally he was still in good enough, robust health.
Do you mean World War One?
Yeah, World War One. Did I say two?
Yeah.
Oh.
It would have been.
Oh yeah, World War One.
Mm-hmm. And go ahead.
That's it. I mean, he just went through a lot of stuff. That's all. And then of course we had to go through the Depression. He had all of that to go through. I guess the Harper side of the family had some ingenuity too, because he, having been a mining engineer and a civil engineer, for some reason, I don't know why, got onto the idea of reclaiming an old gold mine out in East Alabama, in Clay County, Alabama. And so he persuaded a couple of Jewish merchants to finance it. I don't know how. And we went out there, that's quite a story of our living in Clay County, and opened that mine, at least did well enough so that it continued for several years, which was a great thing for that area where the farmers were just destitute as everybody else in the Depression, because he hired, probably 18, 20, 25 men from that area. I can remember kind of being a water boy and even learning how to drill and stuff as a young boy, almost a teenager.
What was drilling?
drill, you know, you stick that drill, that long shaped drill there, and then the guy behind it slams it, and you turn it one bit, drilling holes, which now they do, of course, with machines, into which you put the dynamite, and then the cap, and everybody would clear out and shoot that off. I can remember the acrid smoke, I can still smell it. And it would just really give you a headache. And so they didn't have any blowers or anything then, just wait until everybody outside until the mine cleared enough so that they could go back in. And yeah, it was kind of interesting and thrilling. My dad reached into a toolbox in the mill that they built, and hand came up with a rattlesnake still hanging on that it bit and was stuck in there. Shook that off. Fortunately, there was a fellow standing there with some wadding, and he just laid his hand over and he tied it up with a little tourniquet. And then came a call down to the house where I was, where we lived, where the only only car in the whole area, Model T Ford, was kept. And so this young fellow got the Model T Ford started. I went with him. We went up to the mine and got Dad in, and then raced as fast as we could the 7 miles into Ashland, the county seat. And fortunately, a doctor was there and got some treatment. I don't know what kind or how much it was. But for about 2 days and nights, my dad sat in bed with his right arm swollen like a ham. And the doctor said to keep him that way, because if that poison goes up over his shoulder to his heart, he'll die. So that's the vision that we were with, and Mama bathing his arm occasionally with Epsom salt water, thinking about it now. I mean, I don't think any of that had anything to do with the poison that was in the system. But he got through that all right, but that was kind of a scary time for us. Well,
were there other jobs that you did at the time? You know, like during the Depression, jobs that you did with your dad?
Not with Dad, no, but on that, we stayed in one half of a little farmhouse. Finally, after first time we moved into Clay County, we found right along the Talladega Highway, which was a gravel road, the best in the area. Not far off of it, I could just see the little house. It's actually a shack. I can remember that you could lie on your cot at night and look through the cracks out and see the moon and the stars and stuff. So, and of course there was no insulation or anything like that. That one little room, one room deal where we all were, and there was a kind of a makeshift well out behind, and that was it. We stayed there through sort of the spring and summer, and then got into this house that was divided, a hallway down the middle, room on one side, the room on the other, and a kitchen in the back here. And so we had half of that house shared with a family that we rented it from. The young man that owned the Model T Ford. Well, they were farmers, and so I worked there on, you know, on the farm, doing everything, learning to do all the chores around and helping around the yard, and cutting firewood and stuff like that, going out into the woods in the fall to chop down trees and all that stuff. All of which helped me in terms of being more muscular, I mean, and in good shape. And then learned to plow. I can remember that very well. So I finally got so that they trust the whole field to me, and I'd go out, you know, plow.
Describe plowing to us.
Well, you got the mule in front, and you got this single plow in behind, you know, and you've got to could stick that down in the ground and then keep it on some kind of a furrow, you know, and every now and then if it was much clay, you'd have to kick off the, I can remember that, you know, clean it off, kick it off with your foot. Then you'd go down one row and turn the old mule around, and you'd come back, make another. The object was to try to make your furrows as straight as possible. And the person can get so you can do that. But then again, I was building up strength just handling that plow, which is, you know, fairly heavy. And then, of course, when it come time for chopping cotton or chopping the corn, means chopping the weeds out from around them, you know, and then you work with the hoe. Do that. Cotton picking time, I picked a lot of cotton, and I like to, you know, it's always kind of a contest, like Stevie makes it now, to see if I could do more than anybody else, you know, pick more cotton. You go and top the corn, and then if you pull them off, you know, I mean, and your hands were usually pretty well cut during that season, because just grabbing, it didn't have any gloves, yanking that corn off, and then you'd husk it and put the corn into the little storehouse, little bin, or crib they called it, and hope the rats didn't get more than you got.
Describe picking cotton. What was the process?
The cotton is there in a little bowl, you know, and it kind of opens up. Well, and those things are sharp, too. You grab the cotton, you know, get a good hold of it and pull it out of that bowl. And you want to do that as cleanly as possible. You go across the cotton field's been picked, you can still see little shards of cotton hanging, but you can get most of it. And it'd be maybe several bowls on one stalk, and then you move on down the road. So for the most part, you're bent over. You've got a sack over your back that you throw it into. When that sack gets full, you take it over to dump it into a wagon or whatever else. And so you'd have a bunch of people in a row just going right down through the field. And of course, one little machine comes along, does all that quickly and easily, but it was hot. Oh yeah.
In your hands?
Hands?
From picking cotton?
Yeah, you get, you know, your hands get pretty rough doing that kind of stuff. But I always enjoyed it. I always enjoyed hard work and just physical stuff. It was just all right.
It sounds like your dad was the same way, that he
Yeah, must have been.
enjoyed physical work, he would put himself in that. Was there a story of him being in Montana?
I'm not real sure of it, but I think at one time I heard that he came to Marysville. Now I don't think he couldn't have stayed here very long. But I know he did get down into Cripple Creek, Colorado, and then moved on down I don't know how long he was in the Tombstone area, but maybe on his way down to Mexico then. Met my Uncle Aaron, who already lived there, and ended up there at least, probably like 20 years after he first got there, with that story, and then coming on out to World War II, or World War I. But meanwhile, somewhere along the line, they went down into Bolivia, I think it was. You remember the story of who are the guys? Raindrops keep falling.
Oh yeah, Butch Cassidy.
Well, they did that, you know. In fact, that's where they supposedly were killed down there. So apparently there was that kind of flow of traffic through there. Evidently there were big mining companies that hired people and took them in. I don't know how long Dad was there. I do know that he learned Spanish well enough so that for a company that he was working for there, he did all their documents, and particularly all their legal ones that had to have precise Spanish and the rest of it. So he knew Spanish very well.
When you mentioned that he had studied a little German, he'd studied a little Spanish, what was his education?
He had a high school education, and I think maybe he went to Case, Delbert it was at the time. It's, well, the college is still there.
Is it Case Western?
Yeah. In fact, that's a place where they've got a lot of records and stuff about my ancestor Alexander Harper, who was the first white settler into northeast Ohio. So I don't know in all the particulars of what he had, but
Some college classes.
anyway, by the time he was 20 or 21, he didn't get a college degree, a 4-year college degree of any kind. Although he had a degree in civil engineering, which he picked up somewhere along the way.
You don't know where he studied engineering?
Don't know.
I wonder where that would have
May
been.
have heard, but you know.
And what was your mother's education?
My mother went through schools in Fairfield, in Prattville, Alabama, in Pratt City, Alabama, and was a school teacher in Fairfield, Alabama, a suburb of Birmingham, when Daddy met her. So she at least had a school teaching degree, but in those days, just about all you had to do was finish high school, take maybe a little special course, and you were a teacher. So, and she had taught for several years, was getting to be an old maid school teacher, I guess she probably would have been called. Of course, in those days, if you were married, you couldn't teach school, at least not in Alabama. So when she married Daddy, then of course she had given up teaching.
Do you know anything about that custom? What was the rationale behind married women not being able to teach?
It doesn't make any sense at all, does it? Except that married women were supposed to be in the home, for one thing, and secondly, suppose you hired a lady who was married to teach your school for the year, and her husband had to move his job. And of course, she'd be expected to go with him, so maybe that was the rationale, I don't know. Also, usually whatever teacherage they had would have been just a small affair, or else a room somewhere, and you know, as a single woman you could do like that, but not, you couldn't do a family. So I don't know what the rationale was, but that was true. It was true here in Montana, maybe pretty generally.
Do you know how long that lasted?
A lot of these things lasted up until World War II. And then women moved in on everything. Rosie the Riveter moved in. And women were flying planes, you know, ferrying planes back and forth and Tim's mother, Polly, was actually an instructor for pilots and for little planes and stuff. So
How did she get into that?
how did she get into it?
Yeah.
I have no idea. Polly got into a lot of things I had no idea how she got into. Yeah. Somebody probably said one time, why don't we take a training in this or that? It's fine.
What experiences did you have with that change, that shift, you know, cultural shift, when women started to become more in charge? doing jobs that men who are off in the war are doing?
Well, everybody, there wasn't any big to do about it because it had to be done. That's all. Of course, in our family, there never was any question about who was, you know, equal or better. Knowing Dorothy, you know, I never had any questions about what she was capable of doing or like that. But it was just that the customs and the culture of different places little different. Down south, women were, and you still got these particularly, quote, religious, super religious people who feel that the woman is to be that way.
Isn't that coming from some biblical quote or
Oh,
exhortation?
well, you know, in biblical times, of course, women were supposed to be subservient in so many ways, and were pretty much relegated to the business of being wives and mothers. They didn't have any opportunity much. There are some instances, like up in Macedonia, in that part of Greece, evidently women had more leeway for work and all. When Paul saw the vision of a man from Macedonia in his dream, asking him, begging him to come over and preach the gospel, when he got there, the man that he met was a woman named Lydia, who was evidently a prominent businesswoman of that area, who not only worked there, but even abroad, buying and selling purple goods and stuff. So, it depends on your culture. But in the South, women did work. And what could they do? Nurses, secretaries, waitresses, teachers, in sometimes. That's about it. I mean, there was a woman doctor in Nashville. That was kind of an oddity. You didn't have women lawyers. Of course, no women running for office or being mayors of towns or governors and things like that. All that's come during your lifetime.
And did you have any difficulties with that, or
Did I?
Yeah, or run into other people like
I've
when
always-
you have to.
I've always been for other people doing all the work. Men or women. No, I never had, from the word go, I've always encouraged that. Sort of, not only favored it, but tried to build that idea. And we didn't have to even mention it in our family, of course. I mean, Nanny and Jenny, why tell them that what they can do or can't do, because nobody can do that.
Did you ever run into like conflicts with other people? Times when you would have to advocate for it, or and especially in like in a theological way with religious people.
Oh yeah, you go through that. You still go through it, you know, with people who feel that the husband has to be the guy in the family. In fact, the Southern Baptist Church has made that the official part of their doctrine anymore. The man is the head of the household. It's the way God wants it.
And
God being the man, who's the head of the cosmic household.
so what argument or how do you support, you know, it's like theologically, religiously, the other side of that there isn't necessarily
Well, you can, if you need resource, you go back to Jesus, who obviously accepted women as his disciples as well as men, and held women accountable in the same way that he held men accountable. Uh, and then Paul, of course, later on realizing there's no difference in the body of Christ, male, female, Gentile, Jew, whatnot. So that's our base Christian tradition. How that works out in society is a struggle we have. I don't see how anybody who has common sense, who deals with people, could make a case for men being superior to women in any terms. Maybe if you had a contest chopping down trees or something, the average man might be able to beat the average woman. But even that now, in terms of sports and the rest of it, you can't be hard put to it. You know, the same way we believed in white superiority as over against blacks. And if you just look at it, you know, look at what's happening, there's no way you can keep that. John Wesley believed that we not only base our Christian faith in our scripture, which tells us that not only about all the old stuff, but particularly about Jesus himself, and church tradition, which you can't just slough off because people do learn across the centuries some things. But then he added reason. And that's the thing where most of our religious people lack nothing. Just take a look. You know, if you're married to a woman that you recognize is better than you are, I mean, how do you make that? I suppose in a defensive way, then a person gets into an organization that touts male superiority. But anyway, and then the third thing is your own experience. And I've been thinking a lot about that lately. I think those four things together do make a pretty good basis for making decisions. God gave us minds, and meant for us to use them. We haven't even yet begun to evolve into what human beings can be, I don't think. And we're just in a little process right now, and this business with recognizing and using the talents of women as well as men is part of it. Politically, I've always been inclined to everything else being equal, I'd back a woman for an office, or campaign for her. Part of the same thing, to get a matter of using women power as well as manpower. But I digress.
Well, and have you had any conflicts with that within the church, within the Methodist Church, as you've been a professional within the church?
Well, of course, you realize that for many years after I became a pastor, women were not allowed to be ordained. That's only fairly recent. 1956, I think. Maybe even a little later than that women could be ordained as Methodist ministers. Even as recently as when Mary Ann Neeson came to our church, there were people who didn't like the idea of although they had been somewhat conditioned, because Bob and I and other pastors that took this point of view had expressed ourselves. But look around today, there are a large bulk of churches in the Helena area would not allow a woman to be a minister. Many of them will not allow a woman to be on the board of administration or whatever they call it. Quite a few of them wouldn't even have a woman be an usher in the church. You think about that. This isn't all in the past. I'd say thank God we moved a little past it now. Once again, every time a capable woman is given a chance and proves herself, that knocks another big hole in the argument on the other side. I don't think anybody, any fair-minded person can hear Mary Ann preach and say that men can do better than that. Or to have heard, what's her name last Sunday?
Gail.
Gail Murphy-Geist.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I was in seminary in the 1940s, 44, 45, 46, there was a female professor named Georgia Harkness, who was, everybody agreed was great. It was kind of an oddity, a woman being able to be a great theologian and teacher. But she was in the vanguard. In our Montana annual conference, a woman named Ellen Rose, as Monroe used to say, smarter than any of the guys we've got, and better educated, but couldn't become ordained until the Methodist General Conference, I think in 1956, okayed it, and we immediately called a meeting of our annual conference so we could ordain Ellen Rose as the first woman to be ordained in what's now the United Methodist Church.
And she had been serving as a pastor?
For about 20 years.
And
As a next woman who could serve then as accepted supplies, called. Even though she had all the credentials and stuff, more than most of the guys in our conference. And now, well over a third of the ministers in the Yellowstone Annual Conference are women. Our present district superintendent, who's now going off, a woman. The new one who's coming, a woman who started in as little Susan Kidder in the MYF camps at Flathead, through our church, married here, raised her family, worked in our church, decided to be a minister. All those things open to women now.
When did, I'm going to jump back just a little bit about your experience in Yellowstone Conference. When did you first come to Montana?
In 1951, in the summer, when I was with the National Conference of Methodist Youth out of Nashville, Tennessee, we lived in Nashville, Tennessee, I was invited to come and speak to be the speaker at the Methodist senior camps here, one at Luckett Park, one at Kings Hill, one at Flathead Lake, a week each. And so we decided, okay, that'll be our vacation this year. So we planned to drive out. Rusty, Hal, Stevie was a baby. And Marinelle Schaefer, who was the secretary in Nashville, young lady then, just college age, came out with us. And of course, she always claimed Stevie was her baby because she always helped take care of him. So we came out and we hit Luckett Park the first week in July. On July the 4th it snowed and we couldn't believe it. We didn't have any, we'd come out of 100-degree plus weather. Dorothy had little diapers for Stevie, little shirts, that was all. She had to tie wash rags around his feet for shoes, and she remembers all that very well. It only lasted a couple of 3 days, of course. We had a wonderful time in Montana and met a lot of great people, liked the conference, and easy going way that people had to get along with each other. And people began to say, well, Hugh Herbert particularly, and a layman named Lewis in Fort Benton on me all the time. One of these days you'll come out, Montana. So in 1954, when we thought about 8 years having been enough in the National Conference, we decided to come out. We moved to Great Falls, bought a truck for $500 in Nashville, and loaded her up, and Rusty and I drove that truck out. I don't think he said 3 words the whole way out, just sitting there looking.
How old was Rusty at the time?
Rusty would have been, well, Jenny was born here, so, well, let's see, what Rusty would have been about 7 or 8. On the way up, one way of helping to pay for it, I was to be the speaker at the Wyoming annual conference in Casper. And some people, a young dentist and his family, lived in a house way up on top of the mountain. I can remember that, but don't remember his name. They took Rusty in and helped take care of it. And then after that, 2 or 3 days, we came on up, moved to Great Falls, left our stuff there. By the way, sold that truck for $750 in the fall, so it turned out to be a good deal because people who harvest needed to have just some old truck for carrying stuff around. And so when the family then came out, we lived in Great Falls. We lived in a little apartment, and the only thing I remember about that apartment was that in that series of apartments there was a great big dog that looked like a young horse, and Hal, who was then about 6, befriended the dog. And one day he appears at the front door, the screen door is open, and here's this dog looking out over his shoulder and says, "I want you to meet my friend dog, his name is Sally." Well, this big dog was so bad that people in that neighborhood always crossed over and walked down the other side of the street. Because he was a fierce-like dog. Not with us he wasn't. Hal had it. Jenny was born then. We, the boys and Nancy and I ate a lot of cereal. That was my cooking. So that over a year later, after we had built the place on the other side of town, I was in that area and stopped in at the neighborhood grocery store, and the same woman was behind the counter, and as I came up with about 5 or 6 boxes of cereal, she said, "Is your wife having another baby, Reverend Harper?" So evidently it had been noticed that that was what we were existing on.